Broadway, 1964. Betty Allen stood in the wings of the Winter Garden Theater every single night, fully costumed, makeup perfect, ready to go on stage at a moment's notice. She was the understudy for Judy Garland in a production that everyone knew was barely holding together. Most understudies rarely perform. Betty went on 23 times in a 3-month run. Not because Judy was being difficult or unprofessional, but because Judy's body and mind were failing in ways that made consistent performance impossible. For 3 months, Betty lived in Judy's shadow, learning more about fame's cost than she ever wanted to know. She watched audiences arrive hoping to see a legend and leave having seen a broken woman barely surviving. She witnessed the cruelty of an industry that kept extracting value from someone who had nothing left to give. And she learned that being Judy Garland's understudy meant being ready not just to perform, but to watch a tragedy unfold in real time. 50 years later, Betty finally spoke about those 3 months, and what she revealed changed how we understand Judy's final years. Betty Allen came to the job as a working Broadway actress with decent credits but no major stardom. When the opportunity to understudy Judy Garland came up, it seemed like a dream. Close proximity to a legend, guaranteed salary for the run, and the slim possibility of actually performing. Betty accepted without fully understanding what she was signing up for. The first rehearsal revealed that this would be unlike any understudy position she'd previously held. Judy arrived 2 hours late to that first rehearsal, and Betty immediately saw that the woman walking into the theater bore little resemblance to the vibrant star from old films. She looked exhausted, decades older than her actual age, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body wasn't fully cooperating. But when Judy began to sing, Betty understood why audiences would still pay to see her. The voice was damaged, but emotionally devastating, carrying authenticity that technical perfection could never achieve. What Betty learned quickly was that her actual job had little to do with typical understudy duties. The stage manager pulled her aside after that first rehearsal and explained the reality. Judy's attendance and ability to perform were unpredictable. Betty needed to be fully prepared every single night. Not as unlikely backup, but as probable necessity. She would be paid well for this constant readiness, but she should understand that she was essentially being hired to witness and manage Judy's deterioration. The first time Betty went on was the third performance of the run. Judy had shown up to the theater, but was in such poor condition backstage that the director made the call 30 minutes before curtain. Betty performed that night to an audience clearly disappointed they weren't seeing Judy Garland. The applause was polite but unenthusiastic. Betty understood immediately that no matter how well she performed, she represented failure to deliver. The star audiences had paid to see. It was a position that required swallowing pride and accepting being the consolation prize. But what troubled Betty more than the personal slight was what she witnessed on the nights when Judy did perform. Betty would watch from the wings, still in full costume in case Judy couldn't continue, and what she saw was heartbreaking. Judy would give everything she had to audiences who loved her, but the effort required was immense and visibly draining. Between songs, during applause, Betty could see Judy's facade crack, could see the exhaustion and pain that the performance required her to hide. The backstage reality contradicted everything audiences believed. Before performances, Judy would often be in crisis, sometimes unable to remember blocking or lyrics, sometimes physically unstable, always terrified. Betty watched handlers and producers push her toward the stage regardless of her condition, caring only about whether ticket holders would get the star they'd paid for. The calculation was brutally simple. If Judy could physically stand and produce sound, she would perform. Betty also witnessed the pharmaceutical situation that everyone pretended not to notice. Various people had access to medications they would provide to Judy before performances. Betty recognized some as the same drugs that had been destroying Judy for decades. Others she couldn't identify. But she saw the pattern: medications to function, different medications to manage the side effects of the first medications, an endless chemical cycle that was slowly killing someone in plain sight while everyone looked away. What made Betty's position uniquely painful was the intimacy it created without real relationship. She spent 3 months in constant proximity to Judy, but rarely spoke to her directly. She learned Judy's rhythms, habits, and struggles through observation rather than conversation. She became expert in reading Judy's physical state from a distance, predicting whether she would make it through a performance or collapse. This enforced voyeurism felt invasive and sad, turning Betty into unwilling witness to private suffering. The nights when Judy couldn't continue mid-performance were the worst. It happened 4 times during the run. Betty would hear the music stop, the confused murmurs from the audience, then the stage manager's urgent whisper that she needed to go on immediately. She would rush onto stage, pick up in the middle of a scene, and perform for an audience that was processing disappointment and concern simultaneously. Those were impossible performances, trying to entertain people who were worried about the woman who had just left the stage. Betty also observed the cruelty of some audience members who felt entitled to perfection because they'd purchased tickets. She heard complaints when Judy's voice cracked or she forgot lyrics. She saw people demand refunds because the performance hadn't met their expectations. These reactions revealed how fame creates dehumanization, turning a struggling person into a malfunctioning product that failed to deliver promised entertainment value. But there were also moments of genuine connection between Judy and audiences that moved Betty deeply. When Judy was having a relatively good night, when her voice worked and her memory held, the communication between her and the audience was electric. Betty recognized she was witnessing something rare: performance as conversation between wounded performer and compassionate witnesses. Those nights reminded Betty why Judy kept trying despite everything, why she couldn't quit performing even when it was destroying her. What Betty learned about fame during those 3 months fundamentally changed her own career ambitions. She had entered theater dreaming of stardom, of her name on marquees and audiences coming specifically to see her. Watching Judy, she recognized that fame at that level came with costs she wasn't willing to pay. The loss of privacy, the reduction of personhood to product, the audience's sense of ownership over your body and time. Betty left that production grateful she wasn't famous and never would be. The final performance of the run was particularly difficult. Judy made it through the show, but barely. Betty watched from the wings as this woman who had been performing since childhood, who had given everything to audiences for decades, struggled through her final bow. The applause was enthusiastic, but Betty wondered if anyone in that audience understood they were watching someone who had nothing left to give, being asked to give more anyway. After the production closed, Betty never saw Judy again. She followed her subsequent career from a distance, reading about the continued struggles, the final performances in London, the inevitable death that came just 5 years later. Each news story reminded Betty of those 3 months in the wings, watching tragedy unfold while being powerless to prevent it. What haunted Betty for decades was the question of complicity. By serving as understudy, by being ready to step in whenever Judy couldn't perform, had she enabled the continuation of exploitation? If understudies hadn't been available, would producers have been forced to cancel performances and give Judy the rest she desperately needed? Betty understood rationally that one understudy's refusal wouldn't have changed systemic dynamics, but the question persisted nonetheless. In her interview recorded in 2014, Betty spoke carefully about those 3 months, trying to honor Judy's memory while also providing testimony about what she witnessed. She described Judy not as a difficult star, but as a dying woman being forced to perform anyway. She spoke about an industry that valued ticket sales over human welfare, that treated performers as replaceable parts in a profit-generating machine. And she acknowledged her own position as someone who benefited professionally from Judy's inability to function, a moral complexity she never fully resolved.